am Amy Vetter, and welcome to the Breaking Beliefs podcast. This valuable time is for you to pause in your day and go on your own self-journey. Discover the beliefs that are holding you back from living your best life at work and at home. Learn from the guests on this show as they share their inspirational stories on how they found ways to break internal beliefs that were no longer serving them. Because if you believe you can, you will. And our podcast begins now. Welcome to this episode of Breaking Beliefs. And believe it or not, we are at the end of quarter two, beginning of quarter three, and it is time for our recap of the interviews that I've had during quarter two 2020, which we could have never imagined was going to be the way that it was when this year began. And we've encountered so much change, not only in our businesses, but personally, and have been challenged at a level that we've really never seen before. So when I look at the interviews that I've had over the second quarter during this podcast, there's definitely been some themes that have risen to the top, where we needed inspiration and we needed to know that we've been through stuff like this before, maybe different in the past, but we have experiences that we can pull from to help us into the future. And when I look at those themes, definitely I've seen that we've had topics around leading through change and what we need to do, whether we are the leader in a business or coming through the ranks, of how we create a positive environment and help those around us, and also help ourselves to thrive and succeed. Also, through no intention of what ended up happening with George Floyd during this quarter, we had a lot of talks about being open to learning and diversity and inclusion and what that has meant to different people, and how they have incorporated that personally and with the people that they work with as well. So that was a really interesting theme that rose up, as well as just not fearing the future. And I think there's been no better time to have that theme, because sometimes it's really hard when change occurs to not create stories and so forth, but instead really taking time to visualize what could the future look like and how do we get to the place that we want to be. Maybe that route looks a little bit different. And we also had a theme about relationships and how important relationships are in thriving. So many of us have gone through a lot during this last quarter, myself included. And I know that I personally could have never gotten through that without the people that matter the most, whether that be in my work life, whether that be in my personal life, and how important it is to cherish those relationships and also nurture them over time, because you never know when you're going to need those people, that community. So that was a major theme, as well as making sure you follow your heart and your passion in life to create the success that you want. And there's really no better time than now to be stepping back and saying, were the things that I was doing serving me? Or is it time to step back and look at, where do I need to pivot? And what are the things that I need to do? So going back and reviewing some of the interviews that I had over this last quarter that reflected those themes, one of them being leading through change. And I interviewed Richard Koppelman of Aprio, who is a managing partner. And he really had some great tips about how to do this, because in his accounting firm, things changed overnight. Everyone was virtual. And so how do you still create the culture that you want and make sure that your clients are being taken care of? And some of the things that he did immediately was to make sure that they were having daily huddles in the company so that they could make sure that everybody was on their game. Anything that needed to be talked about each day was discussed. And so when you think about putting these quick little meetings together, it's so important for communication that we're not just only on text or instant message, email, that we bring in that human component so that when we're going through change, we're in it together. And the other thing that he talked about was making sure that they were proactively calling clients once every 3 weeks, that every partner was tasked to call every client of theirs once every 3 weeks. And I think when we get in times of turmoil, a lot of times we retreat and we're all about what's happening for us or our business. And we stop thinking about what does the customer need and what do we need to serve that customer. And that can go such a long way, even further than we can even imagine once you get through that time of change or turmoil. And so really thinking about how you go about being proactive and making sure that your customers know that you care is really, really important. The other theme that I talked about that really rose to the top was about being open to learning and also diversity and inclusion. And a really important interview I had was with Kimberly Ellison Taylor, who we talked about just her journey of being African American in this world of the accounting profession and how she got the examples to enter this profession. When we talked about if we don't see ourselves, sometimes it's hard to know that that is an opportunity for us. And that there were people in her life starting from a very young age that actively, proactively went to her school and started giving examples of what these different professions were that she was not exposed to. And one of the really important things that she talked about was that they gave examples that she could relate to. And I think a lot of times we forget to communicate in the language of who we are sending a message to. We're communicating in the way that we know how to communicate, but not necessarily in a way that's effective to the person receiving the message. So when you think about the times where your light bulb has gone off, it's because someone said something in a way that maybe you've heard that idea 15 times before, but they said it in a way that resonated with you. So if you want to change your culture or proactively go out and make sure that your cultures are more diverse, it isn't about waiting to see who applies. It's about how do you go and seek the people that you want to have as part of your organization, and what would be the changes in the way that you communicate, not only initially, but also when you have them in your work culture. How does that change the way that communication happens, that community happens, that acceptance happens? And that's where we really have to step out of our comfort zone and actively go after diversity and inclusion. And there's just been an awakening, I think, this time with George Floyd. And I say this time because this has actually happened so many times. And a huge concern, there is that when, the rhetoric dies down, the actions die down as well. And so we have to keep the message moving and flowing and making sure that we are actively making changes in our organization to not only have outreach of new people into our organization, but we are going and asking the people that work for us what their personal experiences are without them feeling the risk that they may lose their job if they talk about it. So we have to create that environment where there's open communication so that people feel comfortable to expose their stories and their experiences. A lot of times people go through experiences that we don't even know are happening. And because it's very normal to us, we don't realize that someone else is being affected. So think about doing that personal outreach. And if people aren't comfortable speaking to you face to face, that you're sending a survey or something anonymous so that there's a way for people to communicate their experience to them. The other part of this is the learning, right? So we have to be open to listening and learning and making sure we're letting go of our stuff. And so I had an interview with Donnie Shimamoto, and one of the things we talked about is this belief in learning in order to keep growing yourself personally and in your work life has to happen, that you let go of the things that you already believe or have learned in the past, that what you might learn new might go against that, and being open to other ideas and other perspectives so that you can be inclusive and you can keep growing yourself as a person as well. Also, when we're going through change, as we are, that we take those moments to stop and take a breath. I know for me, during this time, in the initial stages of my businesses changing, whether it's been my yoga studio or my speaking business, I went into full fire mode, that I was probably working 14, 15-hour days, running between the two businesses, making sure that we were converting everything and keeping up with what client expectations were and so forth. And then you get to a point of burnout. And I think we have to be really, really open about that, and also expose the fact that we can't run ourselves that way. And even though I teach it, doesn't mean from a human nature perspective, it doesn't happen when you're panicked, right? And it's something we've never encountered before. So this was a great reminder as well of really stopping to pause, take stock in what's happening, and allow yourself to be vulnerable to the situation that you're in. You know, I've had a number of personal things change in my life at the same time as business. And what happens is you start just trying to survive and move forward instead of allowing yourself to be vulnerable to the people around you and let them know that you are going through a hard time as well, and see how you can use your community to help you, because you've probably given to people when they've needed it. And a lot of times we get worried to ask for help when we need it, but it's important to be vulnerable. And one of the big lessons I had, even as part of my business, was being vulnerable to my team after a few months of going through all the changes, of saying, look, here's the situation in the business. What ideas do you have to help us as we move through change? And I had to be open to listening, to not knocking down ideas of saying, oh, we've tried that. Now, I can say when we've tried it, it's happened like this, and then keep the brainstorming going of saying, how else could we go about it? And so I think that's really important as you go through these fluctuations in your life, that you bring people in, are transparent and vulnerable as you go through this. I also talked about this notion of continuous learning with Tom Hood. And one of the quotes that he had was, leaders are readers, and to be curious and to not be afraid. And I think it's very important in these times when we can't see into the future. And I'm a planner as well, that, you know, this is a very uncomfortable time, that we can't predict what next month is going to be, or the following months, next year even. And so what happens is we start making up what that could be, rather than just getting really present in today, in the now. Making sure that we're not creating stories in our heads that haven't happened, or coming up with scenarios that are worse than the situation we're in today. What we need to do is make the best of this moment and learn. So reading books, listening to podcasts, reaching out to your network, your community, to ask other people of what they are doing as well. And so this is really, really important. And this would actually fall into the category about relationships mattering, because we need a crowd of people, a crowd of ideas to make sure that we are growing and growing the way that we think, and also getting other people's ideas and how we might move forward. If we're also trying to move change forward in an organization, it's also important to get a crowd of people and their ideas and thoughts and bring them on the journey with you. So many of us have gone remote during this time, and maybe you weren't remote before, or maybe a little bit remote, but not completely remote like you are now. And we've had to knee-jerk technology in and just kind of go with the flow. But now is the time to crowdsource, to co-create what your future is going to look like, because we've all experienced what we've experienced. So now we need to step back and say, what worked, what didn't work, what will we do different next time? And make the incremental changes that we need to make in order to keep working toward the future that we want. We may not know what that looks like, but if we try to do that all by ourselves, not only is that lonely, but we are going to do things that other people may not agree with. Now, you'll never be perfect and get everyone agreeing with things that you do, but your ideas might be so much better when you bring people along with you. When I talked to Richard Kopelman as well, he had brought up the same thing about how important it was to have communication as he was driving change in his firm, from going from a family named accounting firm to a company branded name, and making sure everyone was bought into that process and how he went about it, and the committees he created, and the communication of each step. And then as actions started being put into play, getting feedback on that as you move forward. What it did was allow people to know that the things that they said were important. And even if you aren't going to do everything that everybody says, you can at least address and say, we heard this, we didn't do that because of X. And that helps people to come along on the journey as well, because they don't feel like they were ignored, but there was real reason and maybe external factors that they would have had no idea to consider because they're not in your shoes. So this is coming back to transparency as well. I had a very fun conversation with John Weissman as well, who is in the music production business, and had moved through sets and stages and management of rock bands, including Motley Crue. So that was like very exciting interview for me, being a rock enthusiast and follower. So, but one of the things that he talked about was how much relationships have mattered all the way through his career to lead to his success. So when you look at his story, and if you haven't heard it, you definitely have to go back to that interview to listen to some of the things that he had to say. And he had some great tips on selling as well. But one thing that he talked about was, some of the relationships from college, because he kept those relationships going and kept helping them, and they would help him and so forth, were relationships that he brought all the way through to his career now, that still help him now, and even from a personal standpoint helped him too. The other thing that he talked about was staying true to your word, which really goes back to what Richard was saying about trust and communication, is that when you aren't true to yourself and true to the things that you are saying to other people, people stop believing in you, and it makes change a lot harder because no one believes that you really have the intention that you're saying that you have. So it's important that we don't always craft perfect communication that is from a corporate standpoint, that it comes authentically from us as we are moving through business so that people believe in the things that we have to say. And we can also talk about the things that aren't going well and where we may need someone's help as well. Now, when we were talking about all this, and he was talking about, his company, they had over 8,500 people working for them, doing rock concerts, musicals, sporting events, all the things that have been canceled. But one of the things that he was talking about through other stories in his career and how he's applied it today is just about not panicking. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, is that you really have to take it one step at a time, put one foot in front of the other, and just know that you are one day closer, and this too shall pass. And when we can keep that in our hearts and our minds, rather than getting freaked out and start freaking ourselves out, instead of really getting really grounded in today, in the present moment, what happens is that when we freak out, then the people around us freak out and they start making up stories in their head. So if we want everyone to remain calm, we have to remain calm and make sure that we are not only reaching out to the people that will help us, but also not panicking and taking those pauses when we need to. And that also leads to not fearing the future and visualizing the future that you do want. Now, we don't know anything right now from anything, right? So we have a blank canvas board of, if we wanted things to look a certain way, how could it look? What could that future look like? And when I talked to Sarah Elliott, one of the things we talked about was slowing down in order to speed up. So just even using my example of how I was going a mile a minute when everything had to change over like it did in both of my businesses, then I knew I needed to stop, pause, slow down in order to know that I'm doing the right things. I'm not just working to work, because what it started to feel like was that it wasn't necessarily productive work. It was just work. And if that is what makes you feel better to be working, but you're driving yourself into the ground, that doesn't help anyone. And it's driving the people around you to be too stressed out as well. So those are the moments to take your team, slow down, start planning, and reviewing what's worked and hasn't worked. And understanding that we are doing as good as we possibly can. We can't expect from ourselves just the unimaginable, right? We're not a superhero, that we are human. And it's important that we understand that everybody goes through tough times. And it's when we are uncomfortable that we actually learn the most, not only about ourselves, but about the people around us, about the business we're in, about our personal lives, all the things that shape us. And there's been no other time that I can think of that, for me personally, but also for so many people, that we have questioned all of our ideals, all of the things that we say, all of our unconscious bias, all of the ways that we've run business. All of these things are being questioned. And so we need to understand that we're going through this for a reason, because there's got to be something on the other side of why we're going through these experiences right now, so that we can actually get to the other side and see the light at the end of the tunnel and why these things have occurred in our lives. There's got to be a message. And usually when you look back, you will see how things connected and drew you to your next experience or your next best thing. So we have to believe, we have to have a belief in ourselves that this is true for us. And so it's important that we don't doubt ourselves at these times, and that we do slow down in order to speed up, so that we can make sure that we create the future we want. I also interviewed Ellie Fathy as well, and this came out just as much about visualizing the future you want. And he was talking about his very humble beginnings, coming here from another country, not really having any examples, but he had this visualization of what he wanted to accomplish by his 30s. And one of the things that drove him was understanding the importance in his life of friends, family, and hard work, which came from his family and watching his family, but knowing that all of these things are what creates success in someone's life. So when we go back and assess things right now and look at where we sit in our lives, it's important to assess, how are we doing with our friendships? How are we doing with our family? And how are we doing with the work that we do and where we want to go with that work? If anything feels off in those areas, it's important that we settle in and decide where we need to spend the majority of our time. If there's other areas where, you know what, they're good for now, then don't try to focus on every area. Try to focus in on the area that needs the most attention. And one of the things that he talked about was making sure you believe in yourself, number one. So part of getting to that sometimes is meditation and understanding the bad self-talk that we have so that we can turn that self-talk into positivity. But having that mindset of attitude and action, that what kind of attitude that we want to put out, that energy that we create, and what action can we take to get there. So we can't just expect things to get better on its own. We have to really take steps, even if they're small, each day, one foot in front of the other, like John said, of making sure that we are doing the things that will serve us into the future and will serve the people around us. So creating more positive energy, but also taking actions that will get us there. What are the things that we need to do first individually in order to help the collective community is where we need to begin. I also spoke to Byron Patrick about this as well, about not fearing the next chapter and being open to what is next. That we need to think about, just in this open world, like he was talking about when he was part of the Maryland CPA Society committee as a young CPA, where he was tasked with, from his task force, design your future organization. And that kind of goes back to what I was talking about with that visualization of your future. So let go of everything you know, because we don't know if any of that's going to work into the future. But from a future standpoint, can you just open your mind, imagination, even if it's pie in the sky, what would you want it to look like? What would you want your personal life to look like? What would you want your professional life to look like? It doesn't have to be real, it can be imaginary. But what's important is once you get that all down, you can start looking at, well, what things can I start working at one at a time? And always look for what's next, because we don't know it all, which comes back to the learning, to always be curious and to keep learning. But it's important that as we get older, as we get more experience, that we realize that we don't know it all. There are things that we cannot control, which has been proven by this whole time period. So what can we do to make sure that we are open to listening, to taking in those inputs, and to keep learning more so that we can design the what's next, or just be patient about what's next and just take it one day at a time. The last area was about following your heart and your passions. And Misty Migia, we talked about her parents and her humble beginnings as well, but the unconditional love and support that she received from her parents that helped her really strive for whatever she wanted to do in life, that there was no limitations on that. And I think even as leaders, we have to remember that we don't want to put limitations on the people around us, that we want to keep that open so that they have the opportunity to really strive for whatever they want to strive for, or create what they want to create. So if we're not supportive in their journey, or give them the right education, or we throw technology at them but we don't give them time to train on it and so forth, then those people end up fearing the future and getting in their own way and can fail. So we want to set people up for success. And part of that is making sure that you create that support system for the people that you work with. The other thing that I loved that her parents did was celebrate each day. And I think there's just no better time to talk about celebration and gratitude. That even though things are hard, we can find things in our day that we can be grateful for, and find things in our lives that we can celebrate. That, you know, all of us have good things happening too. It might seem overwhelming, but putting in a gratitude practice or ways of how do you create a more positive mindset when things are going bad, because that's when the challenge is of creating a positive mindset. It's not necessarily when things are going good. It's testing us of how we can stay in a positive mindset when things are not going so good. And that is only you that can control that. So if we try to put that on somebody else, we won't necessarily get what we are looking for. I also talked to Scott Zarrett about following your heart, and he talked about his own journey of how long it really took him to find the passions that he had, that he was really following the path that other people told him to go. And it really took his wife, or his future wife, one day really stopping him and saying, you know, what is your passion? What do you want your life to look like? And so this goes back to the visualization, right? That when we start visualizing our future, how do we make the most of our life? Because, you know, what we don't want to do is find ourselves looking back one day and saying, I wish I would have done that, or I wish I would have spent more time doing this, or spending more time with a person. That you want to make sure that you feel that you actually were living your life intentionally each day. And so with the challenges that have been, you know, we've encountered during this time, these themes that I've just talked about in these interviews, and you can go back and listen to any of them, are really important themes to help inspire you and think about, how do you lead through change? How can you be more open to learning and making sure that we are not just learning through books, which is important, but also learning through discussion, being open to listening without talking over somebody, and really hearing people's stories and experiences so we can take those inputs in and start visualizing our future. How would we imagine that life could look, our business could look, the way our culture looks, the way our families look, and not fear what those changes might be. Instead, really work on those relationships that we have. So when you step back and look at your community and who's really there for you, I know that's been a big eye-opener for me in the last few months, of people that have really stepped up and reached out, that you might not even have thought you made a difference to them, and they've really come through for you in ways that you can't even imagine. And those people, if you're listening to this, you know who you are, but it has been a really big opening for me to understand that you can ask for help when you need it, and be transparent when you need to be. But also investing in those relationships are really, really important, because those people are going to need you, you're going to need them, and these are relationships that repeat throughout your life, and you don't want to take any of those for granted. And as you're going through this moment of opportunity, really look at how you can follow your heart through all this. Step back, look at your passions in life, step back and look at what's important to you, so that you spend the time on the right things, that when you look back and you connect all those dots, you look back and say, what a gift that I had this time now to review my life, not fear the future, and visualize or imagine a future that I have now achieved. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to the Breaking Beliefs podcast. I hope you will take a moment to pause before entering back into your day to reflect on this podcast and note 1 to 2 actions you are inspired to do from today's conversation that you could incorporate into your life. To read the full blog and listen back to this episode or any other, you can find them at www.amyvetter.com/Breaking Beliefs podcast and related videos on my YouTube channel. For daily inspiration, follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Amy Vetter CPA. I hope that you will choose to like this and subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and more so that you can join us for more inspiration on our next episode.